I watched her board that Greyhound bus without asking her to stay, and I've been replaying that silence in my head for nearly 60 years. The station lights were yellow and tired, humming like they'd been on since the war. Diesel fumes hung in the air, and somewhere behind me a soda machine rattled and thumped like it had a bad heart. She stood at the bottom of those folding bus steps with a single suitcase, blue, scuffed at the corners, the kind with a paper tag looped through the handle, and she looked back at me just once. Not pleading. Not angry. Just waiting. I remember the way my hands felt, like someone else's hands, hanging there at my sides. I had rehearsed a speech all afternoon while Main Street shutters clapped closed in the wind. I was going to tell her I'd come with her to Chicago. That I didn't care about the job at my father's hardware store. That I didn't care what folks said about a man chasing a girl into the city. I was going to say it plain and steady. But when the bus driver called, "All aboard," what came out of me was nothing. She nodded once, like she understood something I didn't yet, and turned away. The door folded shut with a hiss. The bus pulled out slow, gravel crunching, red tail lights shrinking until they blurred into the dark. I stood there until the station went quiet enough to hear crickets in the ditch. I told myself I'd made the sensible choice. Back then, sensible meant everything. It was 1953, and sensible men stayed put. Sensible men took over their father's stores. Sensible men married girls whose families they'd known since church picnics in '41. My father's work gloves lay on the wooden counter that evening, palms darkened by years of oil and iron filings. He didn't look up when I came in late. "She gone?" he asked. "Yes, sir." He nodded, slow, like a ledger balanced properly. I met her the first time at the autumn dance in the high school gymnasium. Crepe paper streamers sagged from the basketball hoops, and someone's older brother tuned the band's guitar near the bleachers. The floor smelled of wax and sweat and cheap cologne. She wore a pale green dress that caught the light every time she turned, and I remember thinking she moved like she was listening to music the rest of US couldn't hear yet. Her name was Evelyn Hart. Her father ran the small-town newspaper, the Gazette, the one with the clacking typewriter that never seemed to stop. I'd hear it through the open office windows when I walked past on hot afternoons, the metallic rhythm mixing with the sound of AM baseball games drifting from the barbershop next door. She wanted to write for a real paper someday. Not birth announcements and tractor sales, but stories about cities and elections and people who changed things. She talked about Chicago the way other girls talked about wedding china. We started walking home together after church socials. The streetlights would flicker on one by one, moths gathering like confetti around them. Our shoulders brushed sometimes, and every time they did, it felt like a current ran clean through me. We'd sit on her front porch steps, listening to the low murmur of her father's radio inside, and she'd tell me about editorials she planned to write. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked me once. "Leaving what?" "All this." I looked out at Maple Street, the neat hedges, the porch swings, the steady sameness of it, and said, "No. Not really." She studied me a long moment, not disappointed exactly. Just measuring. We fell into a rhythm, the kind that feels inevitable when you're young. Sunday suppers at her house, her mother's pot roast steaming on the table. Summer evenings with the smell of gasoline and cut grass hanging thick in the air while we leaned against my truck, talking about everything and nothing. I carried her letters in my shirt pocket when she went to visit her aunt in Rockford, 4 pages of careful handwriting folded into thirds, the paper softened at the creases from how often I unfolded it. She wrote about train stations and crowds and how alive it felt to be somewhere people didn't already know your grandfather's name. When she came back that August, something had shifted. Not between us, exactly, but in her. There was a restlessness in the way she tapped her fingers on tabletops, in the way her eyes followed the highway when trucks roared through town. The Gazette got an offer from a Chicago paper to take her on as a junior copy assistant. Not glamorous. Not even steady work. But it was a door. She told me under the cottonwood tree by Miller's Creek. The cicadas were loud enough to fill the spaces between our words. "I leave in September," she said. "If I go." "If?" I asked. She looked at me then the way she did at the bus station later, waiting. I knew what she meant. If we were going to be married by Christmas, she wouldn't go. That was the understanding, though neither of us had spoken it yet. My mother had already started asking about china patterns. My father had begun showing me how to manage inventory without him standing over my shoulder. "You don't have to decide because of me," I said. It sounded generous in my mouth. "But I would," she replied. That night I lay awake listening to the house settle around me, wood creaking like an old man's knees. I imagined Chicago, tall buildings, smoke curling from grates in the sidewalk, crowds thick as cornfields. I imagined myself there, a small-town boy stocking shelves somewhere while she chased headlines. I also imagined my father alone behind the counter, his hands slower each year. I imagined the hardware store with a closed sign hanging crooked in the window because I'd chosen something uncertain. Pride's a funny thing. It dresses itself up as duty. The next week we argued for the first time. It was soft at first, like rain starting. "You're afraid," she said, not cruelly. "I'm practical," I answered. "You think loving me means staying exactly where you are. I think loving you means building something solid. And if solid isn't here?" The screen door banged when I left her porch that night. I stood outside for a long time, hearing her father's typewriter hammer away inside. I almost turned back. My hand even touched the doorknob once. But I didn't knock. September came quicker than I'd thought possible. Main Street storefronts closed a little earlier as evenings cooled. The high school put up posters for the football home opener. Life marched on, steady and unbothered. We met at the bus station just before dusk. She wore a navy coat, her hair pinned up neatly like she was already practicing being someone from somewhere else. In my jacket pocket was a small velvet box. I'd bought the ring 2 days earlier after a long talk with my mother, who cried from relief more than anything else. I had planned to kneel right there on the cracked pavement, diesel fumes and all, and ask her to stay. But when she spoke, the words rearranged everything. "If you ask me," she said quietly, "I won't go. And I'll always wonder who I might have been." There it was. Not an ultimatum. Not a plea. Just truth. The bus engine coughed to life behind her. I felt the weight of that ring in my pocket like a stone. I felt the eyes of the town on us, even though no one stood close enough to hear. I thought about the hardware store ledger waiting on the counter. I thought about her fingers stained with newsprint ink, about the way she talked faster when she was excited. And I realized that asking her to stay would mean loving her only in the shape I could control. So I didn't ask. She searched my face one last time. I don't know what she saw there, fear, maybe, or something that looked too much like surrender. The driver called out again. She stepped back, lifted her suitcase, and placed one foot on the bus steps. For a heartbeat, I almost reached for her hand. My fingers twitched at my side, but I let them fall still. The bus door folded shut with that tired sigh of air brakes, and she was gone behind a pane of dusty glass. For a second I could still see her profile through the window, chin lifted, eyes forward. Then the bus pulled away, tires hissing against the pavement, and her face blurred into reflections of station lights. I kept the ring. I stood there long after the taillights disappeared, until the stationmaster locked up and cleared his throat like he was embarrassed for me. The night air had turned cool, and the crickets were steady and indifferent. When I finally walked home, the town felt smaller than it had that morning. The next weeks moved like they always did. The hardware store opened at 8. The bell above the door jingled. Farmers came in for nails and seed and talk about the weather. My father showed me how to calculate credit without looking like you were calculating credit. I nodded at the right times. I wrote numbers neatly in the ledger. At night, though, I'd sit on the edge of my bed and unfold the last letter she'd given me, just a simple note with her Chicago address, written in that careful slanted hand. I told myself I'd write her. I even rolled a sheet of paper into the typewriter once, borrowed from the Gazette after her father retired it. I typed, "Dear Evelyn," and then stared at the blank stretch beneath it until the keys felt heavier than iron. What was I going to say? That I missed her? Of course I did. That I'd made a mistake? I didn't know if that was true. That I hoped she was happy? That sounded like something a stranger would write. I pulled the page out, crumpled it, and dropped it in the stove. She wrote twice that first winter. Chicago was colder than she'd imagined. The newsroom smelled like ink and coffee. She worked long hours correcting other people's mistakes and went home too tired to cook. But there was a current in her words, an excitement that pulsed through the lines. She mentioned a story she was helping research, city council corruption. "It feels like touching something that matters," she wrote. I read that sentence over and over. I answered her second letter with a postcard. 4 lines. Safe ones. Hope the city is treating you well. Things steady here. Store busy with winter repairs. Take care. I signed my name like it was a business transaction. After that, her letters stopped. Spring came. The lilacs bloomed along Maple Street. I started walking past her old house less often. A new family moved in by July. The cottonwood tree by Miller's Creek kept dropping its fluff into the water like nothing had changed. 2 years later, I married Margaret Collins. She was kind, steady, and knew how to make a house feel warm the minute you stepped inside. We'd grown up 2 streets apart. Our parents approved. The church filled up nicely on our wedding day. My father shook my hand at the reception like we'd closed a good deal. Margaret loved me in a way that asked for nothing dramatic. We built a life out of small, reliable pieces. 2 children. Sunday dinners. A mortgage paid off before I turned 40. I took over the hardware store entirely when my father's heart gave out one quiet morning behind the counter. And I was not unhappy. That's the part people misunderstand about regret. It doesn't always sit on top of your life like a storm cloud. Sometimes it settles in the corners, like dust you only notice when the light hits just right. Every so often, something would stir it. An AM radio left on in the shop, broadcasting a Chicago news segment, and I'd pause with a box of bolts in my hands. A magazine on the counter with a byline that almost looked like her name. Once, in 1968, I saw E. Hart credited beneath a political feature in a national publication. I stared at it long enough for a customer to ask if I was feeling all right. I never knew for certain if it was her. In the early 70s, Margaret and I drove to Chicago for our anniversary. The children were grown enough to mind themselves, and the store could spare me for a weekend. The city rose up around us in steel and glass, louder and faster than I'd imagined all those years ago. We walked past a newspaper building one afternoon, broad stone steps, revolving doors spinning constantly. I stopped without meaning to. "You coming?" Margaret asked gently. "In a minute," I said. I watched reporters hurry in and out, sleeves rolled up, ties loosened. I imagined her among them, hair shorter now, maybe streaked with gray, moving with purpose through a crowd that didn't know her high school dance steps or the sound of her father's typewriter. I didn't go inside. That night, in our hotel room, the city lights blinking through the curtains, I lay awake listening to traffic hum below. Margaret's breathing was slow and even beside me. I reached over and took her hand. She squeezed back in her sleep. I realized then that the life I'd chosen wasn't lesser. It was simply different. Solid, like I'd promised myself it would be. But every life has a ghost road running alongside it, the one you didn't take. Now, sitting on this porch with my grandson tossing a baseball against the garage door, I can see the whole stretch of it clearer than I could back then. The hardware store closed 5 years ago. Main Street looks tired. The bus station's been torn down. Most of the people who knew that young man standing under yellow lights are gone. I still have the ring. It's in the top drawer of my dresser, wrapped in a handkerchief that's gone thin with age. I've taken it out a handful of times over the decades, turning it between my fingers, feeling the cool circle of what might have been. I don't imagine some grand, happier ending anymore. I don't picture us walking hand in hand through city streets, triumphant and fulfilled. Life's more complicated than that. She would have changed. I would have too. We might have argued in small apartments. We might have disappointed each other. What lingers isn't the fantasy. It's that moment on the bus platform, the instant before choice hardened into history. The knowledge that love sometimes asks you to be braver than you know how to be. And that sometimes, loving someone means stepping aside, even if part of you hopes they'll turn back. I built a good life. I loved my wife well. I raised my children the best I could. I stood behind that counter for decades and watched the town grow and thin and grow again. There's pride in that. But every so often, when the evening light hits just right and the air smells faintly of gasoline and cut grass, I can almost hear a bus engine idling in the distance. And I remember a young woman with a blue suitcase, waiting for me to say something that would change both our lives. I let her go. And in doing so, I became the man I was always going to be, steady, sensible, rooted. Still, if I close my eyes, I can feel that unsaid word resting on my tongue, warm and fragile as it was that night. Some loves you carry home. Others you watch disappear down the road, their taillights glowing softly long after the dark has swallowed them whole.